She is an author, mother, wife, daughter of a well-known pastor, but Shauna Niequist is a success in her own right and says her three great loves are her family, dinner parties, and books. Well, she has incorporated all three of those things and more into her latest book, Savor, a daily devotional which mixes some of Shauna's favorite recipes, comforting reminders of God's goodness, and reminders of how to savor life, family, and friends. Welcome, Shauna.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So why a devotional? I mean, you've written two other books before. This is a big challenge, 365 days.
It is, and it actually came up, there had been other seasons where the publisher had said, is this something you want to do? And I'd always said, no, I don't think I'm ready. And then I went through a season in my own life where I really needed kind of that daily reminder, where I found that life was complicated enough and busy enough where if I didn't make time at the beginning of my day to connect with God, to kind of let him remind me who I am, who he is, kind of what I'm doing here. If I didn't do that, I noticed kind of the lack of that connection throughout the day. And so when the topic came back around again, I was like, yes. And it just very honestly came out of my own need for that practice in my own life.
I think many moms at home, I'm a perfect example of that. Just rush, 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 go, go, go. And then you realize, oh, I haven't had that time with Jesus. I haven't been able to just sit and just relax. And you talk about just almost hearing that drumbeat again. What is that drumbeat and what is that we need to hear?
I think what I have found just in my own life is if I start the day with a deep sense of God's love for me, God's love for all people, of his purpose for me being to be kind of a conduit or bearer of love, speaking words of life and love to everyone I encounter. When I start the day that way, then I see kind of reminders, almost like drum beats, like you hear it kind of in the back of your mind all day long. Opportunity to love, opportunity to connect, opportunity to bless. If I don't start the day with that, I'm less prone to hear that sort of rhythm throughout the day.
Yeah. I love the book because you're really just finding God in the everyday. And you bring up so many different examples of where you've just needed God, where you've just needed to be reminded. Like, how important is that for us to not always be waiting for that big bang or that big, here I am, but just seeing God in the little moments of our day in and out?
I think most of us have this like sort of imaginary sense that at a certain point something extraordinary is going to happen.
Yeah.
That's really not true for most of us. It's really generally not true for me. Most of life is in those little in-between daily spaces. It's the conversation you have with your neighbor. It's the moment you have with your child as you're tucking them in. It's the interaction with your spouse. It's something you read. It's something you feel. That's the fabric of life. That is the good stuff. And many of us, I think, sort of have our lives on hold, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. This is the extraordinary.
You talk also about challenges that you've gone through, having your son in ICU when he was just born.
Yeah.
You've also talked about your miscarriages and how God really saw you through that, just remembering that he has the final say and that your children are in his hands. What a great reminder.
Well, and I think, I think I'm not alone in saying this. I could trick myself into believing that I was in control of things, which is not true. God's always in control of things. But I could mostly trick myself into believing that I was in control until I had kids. And then I felt such a profound sense of needing that daily connection to God through prayer, praying for my kids and thanking God for them, and the challenge of miscarriage and infertility, and then Mac, this child that we had just longed for, we had ached for 5 years, and I had such a hard pregnancy and a little bit of a scary delivery, and then 10 days later we were back in the ICU with him, and it was just such a God met me in such extraordinarily intimate ways in that season. I could feel sort of that breath of God's presence, and I really needed it.
Yeah. Talk, if you're comfortable, share a little bit more about the miscarriages, because I know there are many people watching that just feel like, God, why is this not happening for me? And just feel lost and feel like, what's wrong with my body?
Totally.
What was the inner struggle that you were going through as you dialogued with God and struggled through that?
And I would say I felt all of those things. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with my body? What am I not doing right? Am I a failure? And I don't have any profound wisdom about it, but I would say this, the more you talk about it, the more you realize how common it is, for better and for worse. It's sort of a terrible sisterhood that you find yourself entered into. And it's terrible that you have to enter it, but it's such a gift that you're not alone. So I would say it's really not helpful when people think it needs to be a secret. And when people think, I have actually a very dear friend who had a miscarriage relatively recently, and she came over last week. She and her husband came over, and she said, I just feel so much pressure to be better. For like there's some timer for all people, and I think this is true with miscarriage, but it's true with all grief, with all struggle, that God created us so differently, and that's so good. But we should feel things really differently. We should experience grief differently. We should experience celebration differently. What is just like a tiny little blip for you might unravel me. But what's deeply gratifying and meaningful for you might just be another day for me. So it's okay. I think so much of why it's important to tell the truth about our experiences is because God made us to experience life so differently.
And that's community. And I know that's something that you really resonate with. You have gatherings a lot with your girlfriends, and you talk about the importance of a table. Actually, there was one great quote that you had. This is on December 31st, so the last day. If the home is a body, the table is the heart, the beating center, the sustainer of life and health. How important is the table in your life?
You know, I really do mean that. The table is the center of our home, and it's also the center of our spiritual community. We gather people in our home very intentionally, very often. We have a small group that's met every Thursday night for years. I have a cooking club of best girlfriends that meet once a month. And when you think about like sacred ground, you think about, biblical times, think about the wilderness and what God did in those spaces. When I think about sacred ground in my own life, when I sit at our table, I can see what God has done. I can see how he brought us through that season of infertility. I can see how he had brought people around us to speak words of life into us when we needed them. I can think of times when we've been able to help and repair broken hearts around that table. I think most of us live a little more disconnected, a little more isolated, a little more fast than we want to. And we are craving time at the table. And I always say, the table's where kind of time stops. Your to-do list isn't there, your phone isn't at the table. You actually get a time to hear and be heard, to let someone know your full self, not just like what you can describe in a text. You get to really do some of the repair work that modern life tends to require.
But that can be hard. I mean, sometimes when we're going through challenging times, we want to be isolated.
Absolutely.
We want to be by ourselves. How important is it to be surrounded by people who can uplift us? Because I bet that's what your girlfriends do for you all the time.
Well, and I think a lot of it is creating a culture around your table that this is not a fancy dinner party. This is not show up with 3 interesting stories. This
or how great my life is.
Totally.
Or,
This is like table as hospital, table as refuge. So this friend of mine, I mean, we did, she is almost drowning under the grief of this miscarriage. And so we didn't say like, we're putting together a fancy something, can you put your heels on? It was like, get yourself here. With your ponytail, with your pajamas, don't bring a thing. Let yourself be stitched back together by the time you spend with people who love you. And so I think that's a lot of it. Is when people say like, how do you do so many dinner parties? They're like, dinner parties might not even be the right term for it. We're talking about like
family getting together.
Show up, take your shoes off, get yourself a glass of water, settle in, let the candles burn down. We will be here as long as it takes together to knit ourselves back together. And I think that it's a really different, this is not entertaining, this isn't performance, this is about being seen even in our most kind of vulnerable places.
And telling our story. I know you talk about how important it is to know our story and be confident in speaking our story. And I love the fact that your job at one point was to teach people how to tell their stories.
Totally.
Tell me about this.
So I was a creative director at a church, and one of the things that we knew, and you know this, so you fall into this pattern where there's like one expert who tells us something every week.
Right.
But then in the course of just life, like you see someone at the grocery store or at a restaurant and you hear what's happening in their life and you're like, no, I want our church to hear that story, not just this one story. And so it became my job to kind of bring in this like, hey, I heard you tell me this on the soccer sidelines. Tell me that story. Everyone should hear this story. Hey, I heard you say this at the park the other day. And so kind of saying, there's not just one narrative that represents all of us. And the idea that my story isn't just about me. There's this, Tyler James is a singer-songwriter that I love, and he writes a song, and one of the lines is, my life's not a story about me,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So it's a story about what God's doing in the world. And there are parts of my story that'll intersect with parts of your story. And there's something that you might tell me today that I don't really need it right now. 5 years from now, I'm gonna be like, there is this woman who told me a thing and now I get it. That's why storytelling matters, because it's one of the things that God uses to shape us and heal us along the journey.
And it's being authentic with our stories, because you then go on to say, sometimes when those people went up on stage, they had flowery language, and they added scripture, and they felt that they needed to package their story differently, and they didn't believe in what their story had and how it could minister to others.
And that's why I think, that's why the table is so important. I'm a writer, I obviously believe in books, I believe in the internet, I believe in all that stuff, but there is a temptation in that sphere to paint things up a little too pretty. And there's something about the table that says like, no, I wouldn't put this on the internet. This is what I will tell you because I'm looking in your eyes. And I think that's sacred. And I think in the world today, the more time we can spend looking in each other's eyes, the more healing we can offer each other.
I want to read from January 12th, and it's called On Waiting. And the scripture is, encourage one another daily as long as it is called today. I've always been waiting to become something else, waiting to be that person I always thought I was on the verge of becoming, waiting for that life I thought I would have. I was always one step away in my head. In high school, I was bidding my time until I became the college version of myself, the one my mind could see so clearly. In college, the post-college adult person was always looming in front of me, smarter, stronger, more organized than the married person, than the person I'd become when we had kids. For 20 years, I've waited to become the thin version of myself, because that's when life will really begin. My life is passing day by day, and I am waiting for it to start. I don't want to wait anymore. I believe that there is nothing more sacred or profound than this day. There may be 1,000 big moments embedded in this day, waiting to be discovered like tiny flecks of gold. The big moments are the tiny moments of courage and forgiveness and hope that we grab onto and extend to one another. The big moments are in every conversation, every meal, every meeting. That's the drama of life swirling all around us. How true is that? We're always waiting for that next moment. And when I get to here, when I get to there, and I think as women as well, I don't want to alienate the men watching, but we tend to do that. We're always, when the kids grow up, I'll do that. And it's passing by.
Yeah, there's that great John Lennon quote, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And I just think so much of my life right now is about not what was and not what might be. What is right now? What is the invitation of today? Who can I connect with today? How can I create a meaningful memory with my children today? Because I think the older I get, the more I see how uncertain our tomorrows are. You just don't know. Could be beautiful, could be a wreck. But I want to invest my everyday in meaningful ways.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Shauna Niequist, the book is a devotional. I mean, I went through it and I thought every day, and then you have recipes on top of that we didn't even talk about. But it's called Savor, Living Abundantly Where You Are, As You Are. Now, I have noticed that all of your books kind of have a food theme through them, because you are a foodie, that you profess to be a foodie. Why is that? Why do you love to put in those kind of food terms?
Food for me is sort of a metaphor for like the tactile, real day-to-day parts of life. I think it's very easy in kind of modern Christian thinking to think everything meaningful happens in my brain or in my heart, and this is all just like these are just the details. These are not just the details. God made this extraordinary world, and he made rosemary and basil, and he made sunsets, and he made sand, and he made dirt. And I think part of loving what God made is not just believing things about them, but handling them. And so food for me is a representation of that tactile, messy, real, rich way of living.
Savoring life. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.